The morning my son called me dead weight, I was lying in a hospital bed in Marietta with a fractured hip and a knot on my skull the size of a walnut, and I remember thinking very calmly that I had finally heard him say out loud what he believed about me for years. I'd come off the third rung of a ladder in my own garage, not even up high. I was reaching to pull down a box of Ruth's Christmas things 2 years after we buried her, because I decided I was ready to look at them again. The foot of the ladder kicked out on the concrete, and the next thing I knew, I was on my back staring at the rafters I'd put up myself in 1989, and I couldn't get up, and my hip felt like somebody had driven a railroad spike through it. I lay there about 40 minutes before the mail carrier heard me hollering through the side door. So that's how a 67-year-old widower ends up in a hospital gown with a call button he can barely reach. The hip was a clean break, but it needed pinning. The concussion meant they wanted me watched. I figured I'd be there the better part of a week. And I figured my boy would come sit with me. Because that's what you do. He came the second day. Walked in wearing a quarter zip that cost more than my first car, already looking at his watch. His wife waited out in the hall, scrolling her phone, didn't even pretend she wanted to be there. He stood at the foot of the bed like he was inspecting a job he'd been forced to bid on. "You can't keep living alone, Dad," he said. "No, how are you? No, does it hurt? Just that. This is exactly what I've been telling you. You're a liability now. You understand that? Every time you fall, it's my problem." I told him I'd been on a ladder, same as I'd been 1,000 times, and that I wasn't planning to fall again. He laughed through his nose, that little sound he picked up somewhere, the one that meant he'd already stopped listening. That's the thing about stubborn old men. They don't plan anything. They just become dead weight and expect everybody else to carry them. He said something then to the hallway, to his wife, in a voice he didn't bother lowering. He said, "Honestly, this is going to be a whole production. I do not have the bandwidth for this right now." A whole production, that's what I was. He came back to the bed, told me he had a closing. He couldn't move, that he'd loop back when things settled, and he was gone in under 15 minutes. His wife never came through the door at all. I heard her heels going down the hall before he even cleared the room. Then the quiet came, and the quiet lasted 5 days. I want to be honest about something, because if I don't, the rest of this won't sit right. I built that boy's expectations with my own 2 hands. I'd been saying yes to him his whole adult life. When he wanted to get into property development, I co-signed his first line of credit. When the second deal went sideways, I wrote a check and told myself it was an investment in him. Over maybe 8 years, I'd handed him north of $90,000 in dribs and chunks. Every one of them papered as a loan because his mother insisted we keep it businesslike. And every one of them quietly understood by him to be a gift he'd never have to think about again. I never once made him feel the weight of it. I told myself I was being a good father. What I was being was a soft landing every single time, until the man genuinely believed gravity didn't apply to him as long as I was alive. So no, I'm not going to stand here and pretend I was some blameless old saint. I taught him I'd always catch him. The only thing I'd never figured on was that one day I'd be the one on the floor, and he'd step right over me on his way out. The nurse who worked nights on my floor was named Maureen, and she's the one who actually got me through that week. She'd been a nurse 31 years and had no patience for foolishness, and a soft spot the size of Ohio underneath it. The third night, when she came to check my vitals and saw I hadn't touched the dinner tray, she pulled the chair over and just sat a minute. "Your son been by since Tuesday?" she asked. I told her no. She didn't cluck or pity me. She just nodded slow, like she was filing it away, and said, "I've watched a lot of families come through these doors. You learn pretty quick who shows up." Then she fixed my pillows in that no-nonsense way and told me to eat something so my bones would knit, and I did, because she told me to and because nobody else had cared whether I ate in 3 days. The one call I did get came on the 4th night. My granddaughter. She's my late daughter's girl. I lost Carrie 11 years ago to a drunk driver on Route 7, and her daughter was 9 at the time. And Ruth and I helped raise that child through her teenage years until she went off to school up in Columbus. She's 20 now, studying to be a physical therapist, and she'd only just heard I was in the hospital because nobody had bothered to tell her. "Pop, why am I finding out about this from a Facebook comment?" she said, and she was crying, and I could hear her already throwing things in a bag. "I'm coming down this weekend. Don't argue with me." I told her she had exams. I told her not to drive tired. I told her I was fine. "You're not fine. You're alone in the hospital and your son is a—" She caught herself. She was always more polite than I deserved. "I'll be there Saturday." And she was. She drove 2.5 hours and sat with me most of a day and read me the funnies out of the Marietta Times because I told her my eyes were tired, which was a lie. My eyes were fine. I just wanted to hear her voice. Before she left, she stood in the doorway, this skinny kid in a Buckeyes hoodie, and she looked at me with her mother's exact face and said, "He doesn't deserve you. He never did." I didn't say anything to that, but it set something loose in me. Because for 5 days I'd been telling myself that maybe I'd misheard him. That maybe a man under stress says things he doesn't mean. That maybe my boy would walk through that door yet, and somewhere in the middle of my granddaughter reading me a comic strip, I quit waiting. I quit hoping. I got, instead, very clear. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. Gene Falk had handled my business for going on 20 years, drew up the papers when I sold Calderstone and Monument back in 21, the shop where I'd cut and carved headstones and memorials for 4 decades. Most people don't think about who makes the stone that ends up over their people. I did it for 40 years. I knew the weight of it. When I sold the business and the back acreage to a young couple from Pittsburgh who wanted to keep it running, it left me comfortable. Not rich the way my son measured rich, with the leased cars and the resort weekends. Comfortable, the quiet way. House paid off. A real retirement account, a little over $600,000 sitting where it could work for me. My son had no idea how much. He assumed I was getting by on Social Security and pride, and I'd let him assume it because somewhere along the line I'd learned not to wave money in front of a man who looked at me and saw an ATM with a heartbeat. "Gene," I said when he picked up, "I want to change my will, and I want to know how to make it so airtight that nobody can ever crack it." He went quiet a second. "This about your son?" "It's about me," I said, finally. The second call was harder to make because it meant admitting to myself what I already suspected. I hired a man named Sam Dietrich. Gene recommended him. Retired sheriff's investigator, did discreet work for estate cases, the kind of man who could find out things and keep his mouth shut about them. I told him what I knew and what I feared, and I asked him to look into my son's finances and his business and his marriage, and I told him not to spare me anything. It took him 9 days. He came to my house himself to hand me the report, which should have been my first sign of how bad it was. Because Sam Dietrich was not a man who drove out to soften a blow in person for no reason. We sat at my kitchen table. He had coffee, black, and a manila folder, and he turned the folder around to face me and said, "Read it sitting down, and don't have anything sharp in your hand. Here is what was in it." My son and his wife were not, as they appeared, a thriving young power couple. They were drowning. $61,000 in credit card debt across 4 cards, 2 of them already in collections. A jumbo mortgage on a house in a development outside Columbus that they were 3 payments behind on. His wife had what she called lifestyle brand, which as far as I could tell meant she posed in front of marble countertops that weren't hers and made about $400 a month, doing it while spending 10 times that. The leased Range Rover, the country club, all of it propped up on borrowed everything. That was the wallpaper. Then Sam turned to the page that took the air out of me. There were emails. My son had been corresponding with a real estate agent about listing and selling my house. My house, the one on Green Street with the rafters I'd raised. The earliest of those emails was dated 5 weeks before my fall. Before I ever touched that ladder, my own son was getting comps from my home and asking the agent what kind of timeline they'd be looking at, given his father's declining situation. Declining situation. I was out hiking the Ohio River Trail every Sunday morning that spring. There was no declining situation. He was building one in his head because he needed the money, and a man who needs money badly enough will start, in his own mind, to bury his father a little early. And then there was the part about his work, which was the part that changed everything, because it gave me something to do with what I now knew. My son was a partner-level manager at a development and construction outfit called Heartline Development Group. Decent firm, did commercial build-outs and historic property rehabs all over southeastern Ohio. The founder was a man named Roland Pike, mid-70s. Built the whole thing from a pickup truck and a borrowed cement mixer back in the 80s. Sam's report showed that my son had been padding his expense account for the better part of 2 years. Steakhouse dinners written up as client meetings with no clients. A long weekend at a lake resort in Tennessee billed as a site assessment. Roughly $19,000 all told, charged to the company and dressed up as business. There was a receipt for a set of golf clubs in there. $1,200 run through his materials. I sat at my own kitchen table, and I read that my son was a man who'd let his father lie alone in a hospital while he stole from the man who'd given him a career. Sam waited until I set the folder down. Then he said, quiet, "There's one more thing. About his wife. You're not going to like it, but you ought to know." He'd gotten into her email by means I didn't ask about. There was a thread over a year old between his wife and a divorce attorney in Columbus. Not a divorce in progress, a divorce being planned. She'd laid the whole thing out to the lawyer in writing. Cold as a billing statement, she intended to leave my son. She was only waiting, in her exact words, until the dad passes and the inheritance clears. She'd done the math on it. She figured my house and savings would net my son somewhere around $500,000 once the debts were cleared, and under Ohio's equitable distribution, she expected to walk with a sizable share of it, plus support. She was going to outlast me, cash in, and be gone. She wasn't just planning to rob me. She was planning to rob him too, and he was too busy robbing me to notice. I'll tell you what I felt, and it wasn't rage. Rage would have been cleaner. What I felt was a kind of terrible quiet, like the moment after you finally set down a load you've been carrying so long, you forgot it wasn't part of your body. 40 years of cutting stone teaches you something about anger. You can't carve angry. The chisel doesn't care how you feel. It only does what you actually do. And what I was going to do, I realized, was not get even. Getting even is loud and sloppy, and it leaves you as broke as the other fellow. No. I was going to get accurate. I called Gene back and I asked him a question that surprised him. What would it take, I said, to buy a controlling interest in Heartline Development Group? It turned out to take less than you'd think. Roland Pike was 76 and tired. His health wasn't great. His own kids had no interest in the business, and he'd been quietly looking for a way out for 2 years without finding a buyer he trusted not to gut the place and lay off his people. Gene set up a meeting. I drove there myself, hip and all, in my old F-150, and I sat across from Roland Pike in his office, and we talked for 2 hours. And I'll be honest, I liked the man. He'd built something real. He cared about the crews. He just didn't have another decade in him. I told him most of the truth. I told him I'd spent 40 years building a business that did honest work, that I had capital looking for a worthwhile home, and that I'd done my homework on his company and admired it. I told him I had one personal complication, that one of his managers was my son, that we were estranged, and that I wanted his word. The deal wouldn't change how anybody got evaluated. Roland Pike looked at me a long time. Your boy's the one with the expense account I had my bookkeeper start flagging last quarter, he said. So he already knew. He'd known and hadn't moved on it, partly out of a kind of loyalty and partly, I think, because he was too worn down to fight it. I told him I knew too. I slid Sam Dietrich's documentation across the desk. He read 3 pages and pushed it back and said, "Well, that settles a few things." We shook on it that afternoon. The lawyers took 11 days to paper it. When it was done, I owned a controlling stake in the company where my son worked, and my son had no idea I existed in his professional life at all. He still thought I was a falling down old man in a hospital bed waiting for him to loop back. While the lawyers worked, my body healed. I graduated from a wheelchair to a walker. The hip ached, and the ribs they'd found bruised in the fall ached worse. And the doctor told me bones in a man my age take their own sweet time, and there's no rushing them. So I didn't rush. I sat in Ruth's old chair by the front window, and I watched the river through the trees, and I let myself think. And here's the thinking I did because I owe it to the truth. I asked myself whether I was being cruel, whether a better man forgives. I went round and round on it, and what I landed on was this. Forgiveness and consequences are not the same thing, and somewhere along the way I'd gotten them tangled up. For years I'd called it forgiveness every time I caught him, paid his way, smoothed it over. But that wasn't forgiveness. That was fear dressed up as love. I was so afraid of losing my son that I kept buying him back, and every time I did, I taught him I was something you could use and discard and come back to. A man can forgive his child completely in his heart and still let that child face the full weight of what he's done. In fact, I come to believe that's the only kind of love that ever actually helps anybody grow. The other kind just makes a bigger child. When I was discharged, before the car came to take me home, I asked Maureen to do me a favor. My son will probably turn up here eventually, I told her. Maybe not for me. Maybe just to settle the bill or grab my things. When he does, give him this. I handed her a plain white envelope. Inside was Gene Falk's business card and a single line in my own hand. Monday, 9 a.m. Roland Pike's office at Heartline. Don't be late. Dad. Maureen turned it over in her hands and looked at me, and a slow understanding came into her face, and underneath her professional calm, I saw the smallest flicker of something fierce. Mr. Calder, she said, I do believe I'm going to enjoy this part. He came on a Thursday, 4 days after I went home. I know because Maureen called me that evening from her own cell phone, off the clock, because she said she'd never forgive herself if she didn't. He came to the desk asking when you'd be cleared out so he could close the account, she told me. Called you the old man 3 times. Wanted to know about your personal effects. He seemed annoyed, Russell. Not worried, annoyed, like you were a parking ticket. She paused. Then I gave him the envelope just like you asked. And I have been doing this 31 years. I have told people their husbands didn't make it off the table. I have never in my life watched a grown man's face do what his did. She let that hang a second. He read your note, and the blood just went right out of him. Gray as putty. He had to put a hand on the counter. He asked me what it meant, and I told him I was just a nurse. I wouldn't know. And he stood there reading those 2 lines over and over, like they'd change if he stared hard enough. I thanked her. I thanked her for more than the phone call. Then I hung up and I sat in Ruth's chair and watched the dark come down over the river. And I let my son have his weekend. Sam Diedrich kept an eye on things, because by then I wanted the whole picture, and what he told me afterward was that the weekend was bad for my son. He drove out to my house twice. The first time, he sat in the driveway 20 minutes and never got out of the car. The second time, he brought his wife, and Sam had photographs of the 2 of them arguing on my front lawn, her arms flying, him just standing there with his shoulders caved in like a tent with the pole pulled out. They tried the back gate. It was locked. She rattled it hard enough that the Hendersons next door came out on their porch to watch. They made, between Friday and Sunday, somewhere over a dozen calls to law offices. The ones who talked to him quoted retainers he couldn't cover. He was burning through what little he had left, grabbing at lawyers who couldn't save him, which, if you've got a sense of irony, is exactly the kind of money he used to come to me for. Monday came clear and cold, the river fog burning off slow. I put on the good gray suit I'd last worn to Ruth's funeral, and a tie, and the shoes that still pinched. My hip didn't care for any of it. I leaned on the walker and let Gene Falk drive me to Heartline, and we rode mostly in silence, and when we pulled into the lot, Gene said, "You all right?" And I said, "First time in years." Roland Pike's office was on the 2nd floor, with a window looking out over the equipment yard. Roland was there, and Gene and me in a chair by the window with my walker beside me, and we waited. At 9 o'clock sharp, there was a knock, and my son came in, and I had to work to keep my face still, because he looked like he'd aged 10 years over a weekend. Pale, eyes ringed dark. His expensive suit hanging on him wrong like he'd lost weight he didn't have to lose. His eyes found me first. I watched 4 or 5 different things move across his face in about 2 seconds. Shock, then fury, then a flash of something that might have been hope, then a kind of dawning horror as he started to do the arithmetic. Then he saw Gene Falk, my lawyer, sitting there with a briefcase, and whatever was left of the color drained right out of him. "Sit down, son," Roland said, not unkindly. He sat in the chair farthest from me. His hands gripped the armrests, white-knuckled. I'd inspected a lot of monuments over the years for people who'd cut corners on the foundation, and I knew exactly what that posture was. It was a man standing on something he knew wouldn't hold. Roland did the talking first, professional and even. He laid out that Heartline had a new majority owner. He didn't say my name yet. He let my son's eyes drift to me on their own, and I watched the understanding land like a slow car wreck. Then Roland walked through the performance numbers, the missed deadlines, the client complaints, and finally the expense account. $19,000. He named the steakhouses, he named the lake resort, he named the golf clubs run through as materials, and when he said the words $1,200, my son made a small sound in his throat. Gene opened his briefcase and slid a folder across the desk. Receipts, statements. My son's own signature on every padded charge. He opened it with shaking hands and looked at the evidence of his own theft, and the last of his composure went. "This isn't— You don't understand the context," he started. "I understand it fine," I said. It was the first I'd spoken, and my voice came out flatter and colder than I'd planned, and I let it. "It's theft. You stole from the man who gave you a career, same as you were fixing to steal my house." His head snapped toward me. "You did this. You bought the company to— This is insane. This is my career. You're destroying my—" "It isn't your company," I said. "You're an employee. An employee who's been robbing his boss while waiting on his father to die so he could sell the house out from under him." I watched that one hit. "I read the email, son. The agent. The comps. 5 weeks before I ever fell. You were measuring my house for sale while I was out walking the river trail every Sunday of my life." His mouth opened and shut. He had nothing. Roland Pike folded his hands and said the words that ended it. "He told my son his employment was terminated, effective immediately, for cause. He told him the company would not be pursuing criminal charges for the embezzlement, given the circumstances, and that he should consider that a mercy and not a generosity. He said the severance would be the 2 weeks his contract required, and not 1 day more." 2 weeks, my son said, and his voice cracked clean up the middle. "I owe $60,000. My mortgage is past due. You can't just—" "You should have thought about all of that," I said, "before you stood at the foot of my hospital bed and called me dead weight." He flinched like I'd struck him. "That nurse told you that," he said, "and there was venom in it." "She had every right," I said. "Same as I've got every right to decide what becomes of my house and my money, and the 40 years I spent earning both." Then Gene Falk pulled another document from his briefcase, and this was the part I'd thought hardest about, because it was the part that turned the screw all the way down. The loans. All those years of checks, every one of them, at Ruth's insistence, papered as a proper promissory note with his signature. $91,000, formally documented, every payment he'd never made. Gene informed him in his dry lawyer's voice that I was calling the notes due, that I was within my legal rights to do so, that the first payment would be expected within 30 days. My son sat there, and his legs seemed to give out under him even though he was already sitting. He put his face in his hands. "I don't have it," he said into his palms. "I don't have any of it. This is going to bury me." "No," I said, and I got my walker under me and stood, because I wanted to be on my feet for this and not look up at him from a chair. "You buried yourself. I'm just done shoveling you out." I looked at him a long moment, this man who used to run down the driveway when my truck pulled in, who used to think I hung the moon, who I taught to fish off the Marietta levee and never once taught to stand on his own 2 feet. and I told him the last thing. I changed my will, I said. 2 weeks ago. Everything I have goes to the Ohio Veterans Memorial Restoration Fund. They fix up the grave markers of servicemen that nobody's left to tend. Stone, I'd have cut myself some of it. I let that sit. Your name isn't anywhere in it. The trust is locked tight enough that no lawyer in the state will waste your money trying to break it, though I expect you'll try. He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet, and I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't ache at the sight of it. He's still my boy. That doesn't go away. But I'd learned the difference, finally, between the ache and the duty, and I wasn't going to let the one talk me out of the other, ever again. There's one more thing you ought to know, I said, since nobody else is going to tell you, and God help me, I'm telling you as your father and not your enemy. I nodded at Gene, who set a single page on the desk in front of him. His wife's emails to the divorce attorney, the plan, the waiting. The math she'd done on my death and on him. She was never going to stay, I told him, as gentle as I had it in me to be. She was waiting for me to die so she could divorce you and take half of what she thought you were getting. You were so busy robbing me, you couldn't see she was robbing you. I'm sorry, son. I am. But you needed to know somebody, and this is telling you the truth. He read the page. I watched the whole structure of his face come down. Whatever I'd taken from him with the firing and the loans and the will, it was nothing next to what he took from himself in that minute, reading what his wife had written about him in black and white. Gene and I left him there with Roland. I didn't look back going out the door. Looking back would have meant I still thought my looking might change something, and that, well, like I told myself in the elevator, had finally run dry. He didn't call that day, or the next. His wife Sam told me later, packed 2 suitcases and was gone within the week, exactly as she'd planned, only sooner because there was nothing left worth waiting around for. She filed in Columbus. My son, last I heard, moved into a 1-bedroom apartment off Olentangy, and took a job estimating for a competing outfit. An honest job, lower than he's ever stood. He's paying the notes, $200 a month, which on $91,000 will take him the rest of his natural life. And I think we both understand that the number was never really the point. The point was that for once, something had a price he had to pay himself. I'd be telling it false if I said it left me dancing. It didn't. There were nights that winter I sat in Ruth's chair and grieved the boy he used to be like he'd died. Because in a way he had, and the man who'd taken his place was a stranger who'd left me on a hospital floor. Grief and justice can live in the same chest at the same time. Anybody who tells you otherwise has never had to do the hard thing to someone they love. My granddaughter came down for Christmas. We finally opened those boxes from the garage, the ones I'd been reaching for when I fell. Ruth's ornaments, her handwriting on the tissue paper. We cried a little and laughed more, and on the second day she said, "Careful. Have you heard from him?" And I told her the truth, that I hadn't and didn't expect to, and that the door wasn't bolted, but it wasn't propped open either. If he ever came back as a man who wanted his father and not his father's money, I'd be here. But I wasn't going to spend whatever years I'd got left sitting by a window hoping. She squeezed my hand and said, "That's the healthiest thing I've ever heard you say." In the spring, when the hip finally let me, I went back out to the old shop and asked the young couple from Pittsburgh if I could use the equipment some Saturdays. They were glad of it. I'd started volunteering with that Veterans Fund, and the first marker I took on was a Korean War private named at a county cemetery up near Lowell, a stone so worn by 70 years of Ohio weather you couldn't read the man's own name anymore. I spent 4 Saturdays on it, recut every letter by hand, the way I was taught, the way almost nobody does it now. Stone's an honest material. I used to tell my apprentices that. It doesn't care how you feel about it. It doesn't argue, and it doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. It only ever shows, in the end, exactly what your hands actually did to it. You can't fake a clean cut. You can't rush a foundation, and no amount of wishing puts back what you wore away through your own carelessness. I think about my son when I work. I do. But I think, too, that some things you can restore if you're willing to do the slow, true work of it. one careful line at a time, and some things you have to be honest enough to admit are beyond your hands now. And lay down and let go. When I finished that private's marker and stood it back up straight and read his name out loud where it had been blank for a generation, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while. Not triumph, not even peace exactly. Just that I was finally, after all these years, holding the chisel myself. For 40 years I cut stone for a living, and stone taught me the one thing I kept forgetting to apply to my own son. A chisel doesn't care how much you love the block in front of you. It only ever records what your hands actually do. Every time I caught my boy in a lie and paid his way out of it, I told myself that was love. It wasn't. It was fear wearing love's coat. I was so afraid of losing him that I kept buying him back, and each time I did, I carved a little deeper into him the belief that I was something a person could use and discard and come back to. The fall off that ladder didn't break our family. It just finally showed me a crack that had been spreading for years while I kept smoothing plaster over it and calling the wall sound. Here is what I understand now, that I couldn't see from the bottom of that hospital bed. Consequences are not cruelty. When I called the loans due and let Roland Pike fire him and locked my will up tight, I wasn't punishing my son. I was handing him, for the first time in his adult life, the actual weight of his own choices, which is the only thing that has ever made a grown man stand up straight. I'd robbed him of that weight for years and called it generosity, the truest kindness I ever did him. I did the day I stopped. I think a man owes the people around him 3 things, and I failed at all 3 for a long while before I learned them. He owes them the plain truth, even when a lie would be gentler. The way Maureen owed me the truth about who shows up and who doesn't. He owes them the clear sight to tell real love from the soft, frightened thing that only resembles it, so he doesn't spend a fortune protecting somebody from the very lessons that would save them. And he owes them the backbone to do the hard, correct thing and not flinch from it the next morning, even when the person on the other end of it has your own eyes and used to run down the driveway to meet your truck. I grieved the boy he used to be. I won't pretend otherwise. Grief and doing right can sit in the same chest at the same time, and any man who tells you they can't has never had to be firm with somebody he loves. But I sleep now. I work stone on Saturdays for men whose graves nobody tends, and I recut their worn-out names by hand, one true line at a time. Because some things you can restore if you're willing to do the slow, honest work, and some things you finally have to be man enough to set down and lay quiet and let go of, and walk away from with your back straight.